Professor Milsom, last time we covered your career from your time at New College, Oxford, and when you were Professor of Legal History at the London School of Economics. That brought us to 1976, and now perhaps in this third interview we can deal with the time when you were Professor of Law at Cambridge from 1976 to 1990, and then we can deal with your activities when you retired. So you returned formally to Cambridge after a 21-year absence in 1976. And can you recall the circumstances of this last major move in your academic career?
The chair was advertised. I didn't apply because of the circumstances of my leaving 10 years earlier, so I wouldn't have applied. But they actually approached me, so then I was tempted and fell.
And what? Sorry, I'm interrupting you.
And I can't remember when the St John's College offer came. I think I'd moved to Cambridge from London, but wasn't yet in office when St John's kindly made the suggestion of a fellowship with them. So,
do you recall any major differences at St John's from, as you remember, Trinity some years before? Was it a very different college?
St John's is a more formal college than Trinity. I can say much more. They were very kind to take me in, and I used to dine probably about twice a week. It's a huge college. It's not as big as Trinity, but it's still huge. And if you dine twice a week for 20 years, you'd probably meet most of the fellows. And that's really all I can say about that, I think.
What subjects did you teach as professor at Cambridge?
Well, I professed to teach legal history. I did tutorial classes in legal history as well as lecturing. And I think I was bamboozled into giving supervisions in property law, which actually I quite enjoy always have, because the students find it difficult. And I found it and sometimes still do find it difficult. And that's really more fun to deal with than a lot of stuff that you just know.
Interesting. I must say, from my own experience, I found I had to do land law when I converted to English law, and it was an absolute nightmare.
Yes, I well believe it.
The law of things.
Coming from a rational system.
It's just movables, immovables, mining rights.
History in amber, as it were.
Professor Milsom, were there any major changes that had occurred in the faculty in the time since the time that you'd left?
Oh, lots, but without faculty lists, I couldn't possibly. Lots of the old chaps had retired, and I suppose I'd become an old chap myself. But the main change in the life of the law faculty in Cambridge was the faculty building on the Sidgwick site. My impression is that since that went up, nobody ever meets anybody. Whereas in the old days, there was a little room. It could be used for very small seminars, but was generally regarded as otherwise useless. So we adopted it as our coffee room. And everybody met there at 11 in the morning. And, you know, if you had to talk to a colleague, that was the time to catch him. So one did talk to them.
Yes.
And the faculty knew each other and didn't just sit in their colleges wondering what that chap was up to.
Perhaps we could talk about your extended overseas visits while you were in the chair at Cambridge. You continued your association with Yale. Your last visit was in 1986.
Yale?
Yale.
Yes. Yes, I went there about every second or third year for a long time. It's always fun because the students have no idea at all about legal history. And don't really want to know, but they come to my classes and they ask very difficult questions. And that's good. Makes one think.
You also visited Japan in 1976.
Yes. That was an exchange arrangement between the British Academy and the Japan Academy. And the British Academy nominated me one year. And I can't remember how long we were there for, about 6 weeks, I think.
Quite a time.
And it was very, the Japanese are the most generous hosts you could imagine. And they met us at 3 o'clock in the morning on the airport. And took us to a very grand hotel and let us sleep. And then I had, I think, 2 speaking engagements. But for the most part, it was just outings arranged by the Japan Academy with huge generosity. The executive secretary of the Academy came with us every time, and a young assistant to carry the bags, if you know what I mean. That was great fun. Very interesting. And we were taken to all the main sites by air if they were a long way away, mostly by road or I think once or twice in a bullet train. I've never known so much generosity. It was tremendous fun. And my wife learnt to be careful. If we were in a market or something and she admired something, they'd buy it and give it to her. So she learnt not to like anything. For what it's worth, I still exchange Christmas cards with a number of the Japanese people we met at that time. And once or twice it's happened that if they've been in England, they came to see us.
Lovely.
Very nice, yeah.
Yes, lasting contacts.
Mm.
You visited Colorado in 1977.
Oh, that was a bit of fun. we all agreed that we'd take the first slot in the daily timetable, the class and me, so that we could spend the rest of the day on the Rocky Mountains, as it were, which we did. It was very enjoyable.
How long were you there for, Professor Milsom?
Perhaps a couple of months, something like that.
Gosh.
They lent us the most beautiful house to live in, which it was number 86 or whatever number it was, Boundary Road. And the boundary was the original boundary of the United States before they'd got beyond that, as it were.
How interesting.
Yeah, it was interesting.
Yes. Well, I might try and look it up because I'm hoping to go to Colorado in July.
Oh, right. Yes. Lovely place.
I believe so.
Mm. Are you going to the law school?
Yeah, yes.
Right. Very nice. You'll enjoy that. It's tremendous fun. And I think I've entirely lost contact now, but Irene used to keep in correspondence with 2 or 3 of the faculty members for a long time. Irene being my wife. Right?
I wondered, yes. Yeah. I'd known her name, but in my mind I pronounced it as Irene. But Irene is actually more beautiful.
She was, yeah.
It's a lovely name.
Neither was, being Polish, she was really Ira. But nobody could do Ira. And so she adopted Irene, but she hated the Irene pronunciation. So everybody had to be careful.
Right, Irene is very beautiful.
Mm.
Professor Milsom, in 1981 you went to Monash and you gave a memorial lecture. You were the memorial lecturer there, the Wilfrid Fulliger Memorial Lecturer.
I taught a course and while I was there they made me give that lecture. Which is published somewhere. I suppose I could find it if I looked, but you won't want that, I hope.
Oh, I shall look at it, definitely. Yes.
It was published in their law journal at the appropriate date. I mean,
yes.
Some months later, yeah.
Professor Milsom, that brings us to your time as president of the Selden Society from 1985 to 1988. Any particular recollections of that period?
I can tell you why they wrote me in to be president at that time. The centenary was coming up, and there was going to be an awful lot of jollification which somebody had to manage. I wasn't really thinking when I accepted, but it was quite fun. Our Chancellor, the Duke of Edinburgh, I've always remembered, he's the Selden Society's patron. And we gave a great party to which hundreds of overseas members came. And I said to the equerry, well, look, I won't have the foggiest idea who most of these people are. He said, you just keep out the way, let him make his own way around, which he did with great effect.
Really?
He must have talked to, I think, 50 different people.
Good heavens!
I mean, not just hello, how are you, but actually, he was really wonderful.
Very
made his way around, yeah.
Gosh.
And gave every appearance of enjoying it. Of course he didn't.
Marvellous.
I suppose if you're the Queen's consort, as it were, you live doing that sort of thing.
Yes.
being nice to order.
You were made a QC in 1985. What did this involve? You were made a QC in 1985. What did this entail?
Well, of course, it's totally meaningless. Real QCs, it makes a big difference to their life and practice, because at any rate, when I knew about these things, you couldn't have a QC unless you had a junior, and you had to pay the junior at least 2/3 of what you were paying the QC. So that taking silk was quite a gamble. You might find your practice more or less vanish. But for me, this was just an honorary thing. And it was the then Lord Chancellor, oh dear, why can't I ever remember any names? He'd be so cross. Tory Lord Chancellor, Hailsham. And there was a big dinner. There was a ceremony and a big dinner, and I was made to go and show myself in various courts. I didn't have to do anything. I just had to go in wig and gown and bow to the judge and go out again. This is apparently a part of the routine. So it really meant nothing in my life. It was a nice gesture.
Yes, Interesting. You also gave several guest lectures. In 1980 you gave the British Academy lecture on a mastermind. Do you have any recollections?
That was about Maitland, F.W. Maitland, who invented English legal history. And wrote the book from which we've all copied ever since. It was quite a challenge composing that lecture, because I had a pretty clear picture of Maitland as a very private person. And I thought he might well resent anybody poking about in his past, if you see what I mean.
Yes.
But I had to do it, so I
Yes.
poked and did what I could. It got published somewhere. I think in the Proceedings of the British Academy, probably.
Yes. In fact, it's available as a PDF online now on the Academy website.
Oh, really?
Free. Back to, I think, maybe... I can't actually remember the date, but there are quite a few up there that are available.
Yeah. I'm too old for websites. I don't really understand how the world has changed. You know what I mean? And it's a total change, isn't it?
It is, actually. Yes, and not always for the better.
No.
Yeah. I remember reading in your piece on Maitland that it didn't occur to the benefactress, and rightly not, you say, that law or scholarship as such could yield such a mastermind.
Well, one thinks of philosophers and possibly mathematicians. One doesn't really think of lawyers. But then Maitland was a lot more than a lawyer. So yeah.
Professor Milsom, another guest lecture, an important lecture that you gave in 1980 was the Blackstone lecture for the Selden Society and Pembroke College at Oxford lecture.
I think I gave it in Oxford. It was published as a pamphlet, I think, jointly by the Society and Pembroke College.
And I think it's in the Oxford Journal of Legal Studies.
Oh, is it? Right.
I believe it is.
That sounds more than plausible. Yeah.
I noticed you didn't select it for your 1985 studies in the history of the common law. You didn't choose to include it in that book.
Didn't I?
No. For historical figures, you only have Plunkett and Maitland.
Oh, fair enough.
Another guest lecture that you gave was in 1986, the Ford's Lecture in English History at Oxford. Do you have any recollections of that?
I think I went up once a week for however many lectures it was. Can't even remember where they were given. It was, I think, before the. Oh no, it may not have been. Their new faculty building is a lot newer than the Square, and I can never remember when it was completed at St Cross. I think possibly it was there. I think it was. I remember thinking it might be hard to find, so I made sure I was very early and sat in some common room. And a chap came in and joined me and said gloomily, "I've got to go to some damn lecture by Milsom." I could only sympathise, as it were. So since he was going, I think I confessed who I was. Poor chap. Which lecture was that we were talking about?
This was the Ford's Lecture in English History in 1986.
I think there were 5 or 6 lectures, and I went to Oxford by train, and at least once it was very foggy, so I just thought I'd better stay the night. And the Mitre Hotel, which I've always known, was full, so I stayed at the Randolph, which is a sort of gin palace. It was quite fun. Yes, I'm afraid my memory loses about 9/10 of its content every year, so that I'm afraid you're a bit late if you see what I mean.
Right, I find your memory remarkable, Professor Milsom, in truth.
Mm-hmm.
Particularly about your early years. I think that's often the case, is that one remembers in more detail, more vividly about one's early life.
Yes.
Certain incidents stand out.
Yes. I was my father was secretary of the London Hospital, and we lived in Wimbledon. It couldn't have been a less convenient commute for him, poor man. Had to change at Clapham Junction, I think.
Gosh.
I mean, Wimbledon to Whitechapel was quite a journey by two.
Yes.
And in those days, one didn't think of driving in any way. He wouldn't have been allowed to have the car because my mother wanted it.
To go and play golf, perhaps.
Absolutely. It was a very tiring job. And it had its rewards. There was one, I can't describe her in any other way, little old lady. She was a little old lady. She was also Charrington's, the brewers, and so hugely rich, and lived in a very grand house in Green Street in Mayfair, in the days when rich old ladies still lived in Green Street as opposed to multimedia corporations.
Yes.
And she had a butler. And after I knocked my head in, she kindly asked me to go and visit. And I had a huge dressing on my forehead, and they made me wear a hat, so the hat had a part of the lining cut out to accommodate the dressing. And I always remember the butler opening the door and taking my hat. Those were the days. Fancy.
Yes.
A little old lady living by herself in Green
Yes.
Street with a full staff, including a butler. Amazing. Yeah.
Absolutely. You must have been about 15 or so.
Yeah, I was,
Yes. Gosh.
And during the war she went, she rented some enormous country house not far from Guildford and went and lived there. She was very sweet. I had to find things to do the whole time. And I built an enormous Japanese garden in my parents' conservatory. And the old lady observed this and bought me a most extravagant set of Japanese figurines and little temples and so on to put around the garden. Yeah.
Lovely.
Yeah. I probably still got them somewhere in the basement of this house.
Do you have any photographs of that garden?
I may, if I find it, I'll let you know. I may have, because I was rather proud of it, and I think I took pictures of it myself.
Yes.
Yeah. I arranged a waterfall, which meant a connection with a lot of rubber hoses, if you know what I mean.
And the water actually ran.
The water actually ran, yes.
Delightful.
Only when there was somebody to watch it.
Yes.
It wasn't the only thing in that house where the water was running a lot. My parents had believe it or not, a gas-powered refrigerator.
Good heavens.
Which worked with a little heating element, which worked you can imagine how it all worked. But the heating element in the basement was an obvious disadvantage, and it had to be cooled with a constant stream of water, which was conducted out into an old copper which stood in the garden.
That would have been...
Which became full of wildlife of the most unattractive kind.
So that would have been the mid-1930s or so.
Yes. Yes, it must have been the early to mid-30s, yeah.
How interesting. There couldn't have been many fridges like that around.
Hmm?
There couldn't have been many fridges like that around at the time.
Well, I think there were. I think it was quite a well-known make. And it wasn't uncommon, I think.
Oh.
I think they hadn't really learnt how to use electric power much more easily, as it were.
Right.
But the idea, I mean, there's probably one in the Science Museum.
It would be worth looking at, actually.
Mm.
Yes.
I was taken by my wife's goddaughter's sister, for heaven's sake, who is enormously clever, and she was working at the Science Museum for a time, and I insisted on her showing me around. And there was this wonderful showcase of exhibits of domestic objects from the 1930s.
Oh, fascinating.
My mother's hair colours and everything that I remembered, as it were, was there. Yeah, extraordinary.
Very, yes. Gosh, that must be worth looking at, actually.
Mm. I don't think I could manage it by myself, and the girl is now doing something very high-powered for the something foundation, scientific foundation. The name will come to me after you've gone, and it doesn't matter.
Professor Milsom, while you were at Cambridge in your capacity as professor, there were obviously several colleagues that you may recall, and one name that springs to mind is Professor S.J. Bailey. Do you remember him at all?
Well, I think probably he got the chair when Winfield died, and everybody was astonished. His contribution to legal learning was a rather tedious textbook on wills. And he was quite a good lecturer, actually. His world was peopled by persons called Tompkins and Jenkins, if you know what I mean. And the lectures were quite fun. Very slow, deliberate, precise manner of speaking. He was married, I can't remember to whom, but somebody entirely appropriate. Mm-hmm. And they lived in, if you ever walk on the Lammas land, there's a really quite big house overlooking. If you go out from Grantster Meadows and turn right as soon as you can, it takes you down past this house to the swimming pools. And he rattled around in that. And then I think she divorced him. And he married again, and I really can't remember. It was rather a sad end, actually. He was a very good property lawyer. And it all went a bit wrong. He was a fellow of St John's College, and I think that house belongs to St John's College, and I don't know who's in it now. So John's had successive Rust Bowl professors, Winfield and then Bailey. And I can't remember who succeeded Bailey. Yes, I can. It was Harry Holland.
Right.
From Trinity, Holland. And I think in a memoir published after his death, the writer emphasised the spelling of the name and said it took so firm a root in Trinity that the kitchens still call it sauce hollandaise. He was from... His father was a banker. No, his father was a merchant in India who made a fortune.
Holland.
And when he was about to retire, Harry Holland, I went to, as it were, say goodbye to him. And he said, Toby, he was in an attic set at that time in Knowles Court. I think all these steps are too much for me, and so does my mother. But my grandmother says nonsense. And I never met the grandmother. Irene and I did go to stay with the mother in a grand house in Suffolk. Beautiful house, built by Lord Chancellor Thurlow. Untouched since Lord Thurlow's time. You know, no mod cons of any kind.
Really?
Earth closets. So they were a really eccentric family. But
delightful.
Harry he had 3 sisters. They were all a bit batty. And when Irene and I went to stay, my mother insisted on taking me for a walk. And after about an hour, Irene began to get to fidget and say, well, he'll exhaust your mother. She'll be worn out. You wait, they said. She came back as spry as anything, carrying armfuls of logs, making me carry armfuls, and I was shambling along, absolutely exhausted. She wasn't 100. She didn't make it to 100, but she nearly did.
Really? Goodness.
Extraordinary family. Extraordinary house. Beautiful house. I'm sure with no mod cons, some city gent got it for a bargain and
really
would make an enormous killing out of it, yeah.
Right.
He was Vice Master of Trinity, Harry Holland, for goodness knows how long. And when he gave up, he was succeeded by Patrick Duff, who I think is already featured in your...
Yes.
Neither of them ever published anything. That's not true. Harry didn't publish anything, I think. Patrick Duff did publish one very short article. Quite an interesting article, actually, which made it all sadder, if you know what I mean.
Yes. Was that the article on theft?
You're absolutely right, yes. Absolutely right. Which is an interesting article.
What a shame he never did anything else.
No. He gave lots of lectures, and he was the Scout Commissioner for Cambridgeshire. And if my then girlfriend and I went to a Cypriot restaurant one evening, and there was Patrick in full Scout uniform, which meant shorts and knobbly knees. We pretended not to see each other. He was from his father was a classical scholar, and his father was a classical scholar. And when his father came to be christened, and the priest said, "What name am I to give the child?" And the godparents said, "James Duff." So he came out James Duff Duff. Those were the days. I have a feeling that these days that christenings aren't what they were. I've probably told you about mine. I don't remember it, needless to say, but my mother's account of it was, she knew what I was going to be named, and she was going to call me Michael. But all the godparents were Milsoms. And they'd never had a Michael, and they damn well were going to have one now. So I came out Stride Francis Charles, and my mother wouldn't use any of these names. So I was that dratted infant, until my brother noticed a resemblance to a Toby Jug.
I wondered about that.
That's a rather ugly Toby Jug too. I can still remember it. I don't think I've got it. I might have, actually. I must look.
Was your brother older than you?
Yes. He was 4 years ahead of me, yes. Just old enough to graduate from the Royal Air Force College at Cranwell in time for the outbreak of war, and he was killed almost immediately.
Oh, how awful, Professor Milsom.
Leaving me with the burden of having become an only child.
Yes.
And it is a burden, actually.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
Caring for one's parents in later life can be quite... one does it, of course, with pleasure, but it is quite time-consuming. Did your parents remain in... they divided their time between London and Cornwall?
They gave up London and went to live permanently in Cornwall.
Lovely. That must have been a lovely place to visit, Professor Milsom.
Yes.
Or a nice contrast as well to Cambridge,
yes.
London.
Yeah. My wife and I, after my mother died, we kept the house there for a time, but we could only do it if we let it out. And it's amazing how badly tenants behave. They don't mind damaging things and breaking things.
No.
And eventually we decided this was no good. We couldn't live in it if I was going to keep my job. And without my job, we couldn't live in it.
Yes. So
we sold it to a horrible man who's divided the garden into 5 building plots. And
that's sad.
I went to the funeral of my mother's daily help. They hated each other, but were also dependent upon each other. And the old gardener hung about after the service to catch me to say, "For goodness sake, don't go and look at the house; it'll break your heart."
Really?
so I didn't.
No, wise.
Mm.
Yes.
He was the purchaser was. I don't know what his business was, but he made a lot of money at it. And he came to view the house with his girlfriend. The house was for his wife. She was to be parked there. The girlfriend was his secretary, nominally. Yeah.
Mm.
Oh well. You do get a lot of irrelevant stuff if you talk to me.
Well, it's so interesting and so... Some of it is so amusing. Not obviously they're very... All histories have very sad aspects.
Mm.
But someone else, Professor Milsom, from your time when you were in the chair at Cambridge, was Jack Hampson, whom we haven't spoken of. Is he somebody that you recall?
Yes, indeed.
Professor Lipstein was quite, I wouldn't say close to him, but remembered him quite well.
Hampson.
Yes.
Yes. Hampson was probably the cleverest man I ever met, I think.
Really?
He was a bit eccentric. And he had the misfortune to be caught. He was one of those who didn't get away from Dunkirk.
Really?
And spent the war in a prisoner of war camp.
I knew he'd been in prison, but I didn't know that he was at Dunkirk.
Hmm?
I didn't know he was at Dunkirk.
I may be wrong. He was certainly got into it very quickly, and he was prisoner of war for several years. So there weren't many opportunities for British troops to be captured by the Germans after Dunkirk. I suppose some might have been captured in Italy, but I think they were mostly kept in camps in Italy. Very clever man. Disconcerting to talk to, because you never knew what or who he was looking at. He had serious cross eyes.
Was that as a result of the war, or?
No, I think it was. I think he was born like that.
Oh.
So far as I know.
Right.
He had, when I first. Yes, no, I didn't know him until he came back after the war. He was an extremely clever man.
Really?
And everything that came his way, he sort of chewed up in his mind. It was quite disconcerting sometimes.
Yes.
Yeah. He was married, and they had a child whose name will come back to me in a minute. And she was a very nice girl. And I think Janet, I think somebody told me she died. But that was well after he and his wife had both died, I think.
Oh.
if we'd done this 5 years ago, you would have got a lot more information out of it.
No, this is just so interesting. Actually, Professor Jolovitz was mentored by him, and so...
By Hampson?
Yes.
That sounds right, yeah.
And apparently, I mean, this is just an example of how you said he was somewhat eccentric, Hampson. When Tony said to him, "Should I do a PhD?" he said, "Oh no, don't be so silly. Gentlemen don't do PhDs. That's for scientists. Only scientists and foreigners do PhDs." Which is, sounds...
That was still the ethos in Trinity when I was a fellow.
Yes.
Certainly gentlemen from Trinity didn't do PhDs. And of course, there was some justification, because I suppose the point of having a PhD is, if you need a job, it's some objective. But of course, if you're from Oxford or Cambridge, you don't really need an objective, because your tutors will remember you, yeah, and will tell the truth about you, for better or worse, right, so that you didn't need it.
I believe Hampson wrote a book while he was in prison, called, I think it was Liber Invinculis or something like that, which was later published, and I've been meaning to have a look at it. It's in the UL.
Mm.
I've often thought that would be interesting to look at.
Yes. He became interested in administrative law and the more particularly in French administrative law.
Oh, right.
And he wrote about that.
Right. That's perhaps how Tony Jolovitz became so interested in procedure.
Yeah.
Yes. Someone else who springs to mind from that period, Professor Milsom, is the name of Jackson. Does that ring a bell at all?
Hmm?
Somebody called Jackson. I'm not sure if he was a professor. Jackson? Is that somebody who you recall?
Oh, yes. Yes, indeed. He was a loony. He looked like the Assyrian coming down like a wolf on the fold, with a little beard. And was rumoured to have had a colourful life. Lots of people in Cambridge. I can't remember what Jackson's colourful life was. I'm sure I told you, Henry Barnes. Everybody believed he'd been president of Mexico, and perhaps he was. We've had a go on Barnes, I expect, have we?
Well, not really, but it reminds me of a story that Peter Stein told me about him. He used to thrive. He used to do a lecture on which had at issue committing buggery with a duck. And it sounds a bit bizarre, but apparently he used to really make a meal of this, and he would sort of end the story with a great flourish and say "conviction quashed." He had this sort of Irish accent, and the audience used to flock apparently to his lectures.
Yeah, the Irish accent is absolutely right. Maybe that was why he took to spending most of his lectures telling dirty stories.
Really?
Which, curiously, was not appreciated, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
He thought everybody would like this.
Yes.
We didn't.
No. No. Well, I know that Professor Stein said he thought he had very much the same opinion as you. The lectures weren't up to much, really.
Mm.
But funnily enough, Professor Milsom, yesterday I was asked by the librarian whether I had any information about Henry Barnes, because he had been contacted by one of his ex-students who was looking for some information about him. So I said, well, I'm sorry, I actually didn't have very much other than the story. Not much at all.
I can't remember, and I probably already told you what I think I remembered was that he was a fellow of Jesus and ran off with either the master's wife or the master's daughter.
I think you mentioned that.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that wouldn't do. So he set up as a one-man law coach and taught huge numbers of people. He had a room in, I think it might have been Sydney Street. Can't remember. But he was, one used to go at 6 o'clock or something because Trinity were his favourite customers, so we got the best times.
Oh.
But he was teaching every hour of every day.
Really?
Like poor old Charlie Ziegler, whom I mentioned to you last time.
Yes.
There's a man called Ziegler who's some kind of expert on the royal family. One gets him on the telly from time to time. I've often wondered whether it's his son. If so, the colour has faded away, as it were. But it might easily have.
Yes.
He was half, and his wife was totally white.
Ah.
You know.
One might be able to look that up on the internet. Professor Milsom, do you remember from that time Glanville Williams, who would still have been around?
Yes, yeah. Yes. Glanville and Lipstein were the true tenants of two of the Squire had a series of 6 or 7 mini offices with nice views out over quays, and they were, I think, when the library was built, they were intended for professors and such, but professors and such had better things to do than hang around in the Squire. So Glanville had one and Lipstein had another. And I have it in my mind that old Winfield still used his occasionally. And I suppose when Glanville became professor, he must have become fellow of a college.
I know that he was at Wolfson. He might have had another college, but he's definitely Wolfson.
Yes,
Or he was. I think he was the president
Yeah.
Because there's a photograph of him in their
Right.
gallery of presidents there.
Well, that may be it, because he used to have dining rights in Trinity. But they wouldn't have him as a fellow, to their loss, because he'd been a conscientious objector during the war, and Trinity High Table at that time was full of disapproving warriors.
Very interesting. Yeah.
Great loss. I mean, they missed the most distinguished lawyer Cambridge has had for a long time.
Right. I believe he was quite a shy man.
He was. Yes, he was. He had a house somewhere off the Trumpington Road, Gaisley. There is a little side private road called Gaisley Place or something. He had a house down there, which I never saw. But I did used to see him from time to time, walking home in the evening, twanging the elastic bands on his wrist, which had been put there to remind him of appointments. And he was obviously wondering which appointments they'd been. He was the best approach to an absent-minded professor the law faculty ever had.
Really?
Very nice man. Looked a bit like a choir boy angel, if you know what I mean, which must have been a disadvantage.
Well, actually, I do remember Kurt Lipstein describing him as having lovely, sort of golden curls.
Yeah, and chubby cheeks. Yeah. Glanville was an extremely nice man.
If I remember other reminiscences of Kurt's, he was also a great hiker. He used to like walking.
Yes. Yes, he took me for a walk along the Devil's Dyke once, and it was a hell of a long walk.
Do you remember Professor Lipstein at all? I mean, obviously he was around pretty much when you arrived, initially as a student, but then he was also in place when you were a professor
all
later.
the time, yes.
Yes.
He taught me, he certainly supervised me in international law, which I couldn't get my mind around at all. That all began with one of Herschel Lauterpark's lectures, in which he read out what was then his draft of the Charter of Human Rights, beginning with "whereas." And I'm afraid I found it very hard to take international law serious. But still, Kurt was kind about it and got me through. I think he taught me jurisprudence. No, Glanville taught me jurisprudence. I have a feeling Kurt did teach me something other than international law.
Might it have been Roman law?
It might have been Roman law, yes. It might indeed. Mm.
He was a lovely man.
Yes.
Kurt. Really, really very charming.
Yes. He is he still living in up the road there?
He lived there until he died at the age of 96. I think it was 96, or that was in December 2006. And it was very sad because he used to come in every single day. I got to know him because I had the enormous privilege of sharing a room.
Yes.
When I arrived, they said, "Do you mind sharing with," and I thought, do I mind? And
yes.
It was wonderful. We became very good friends.
He was a very nice man.
Very. And he was so helpful as well.
Mm.
He didn't mind explaining.
He was always helpful.
Really?
Yeah. And one has this vision. His wife was a very large woman, tall, military, in the Ats, therefore in army uniform, striding along with Kurt trotting along behind, as it were.
Well, that was my impression. I never met her, although she was alive initially. I used to speak to her on the telephone when she phoned him. But he made no secret of the fact that she proposed to him marriage. She asked him to marry.
That doesn't surprise me at all.
Which sort of fits with what you've told me.
I mean, it would have taken a lot of courage for even a large, powerful man to propose to
Gwyneth.
Gwyneth, that's right.
Yes.
Absolutely, yes.
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 No, it was very sad, his demise, because he had some complication. In fact, I believe it was a cancer in his stomach.
Absolutely.
The terribly sad thing is that he was absolutely fine.
Mm.
And a week later he was gone.
Yeah.
I mean, I still can't get over it. It just saddens me. He could still have been around.
Yeah.
Because he was such an upliftment. He was an example. He was so...
He had there was an earlier fright about Kurt. His heart began to play up. He was away somewhere.
That's right.
And I remember, I think I drove Gwyneth to the airport to meet him.
Really?
And I can't remember where he'd been. He went into Papworth. We were told to take him to Papworth. And he got over that remarkably well. Mm.
He had a pacemaker.
Did he?
Yes.
Mm. Yeah.
So someone else who would have been around would have been Robbie Jennings for a short time. Do you remember him at all?
Pretty well, yes. I mainly got to know him because my Herschel Atterpark roped in my wife to be, as it were, copy editor for the British Yearbook of International Law,
Really?
About which she knew nothing and would fire questions at me, and I knew nothing, so that was no good. But and then when Herschel Atterpark died, no, he didn't die. He gave up the editorship and handed it over to Humphrey Waldock in Oxford and Robbie Jennings in Cambridge. And so we saw quite a lot of him at that time. Robbie was in the same intelligence outfit that I ended the war in. He was in uniform, Major Jennings, for goodness sake. And I wasn't. And we weren't... it was a chasm as wide as that between Cambridge colleges. We were each in our own hut, and our huts were specialists in various aspects of the work. So I saw Robbie around a lot, but I didn't have much to do with him at that time. And I remember when the war ended, I met him in probably at the coal heap, which was our common resource, as it were. And I remember him saying, "I've got my hut making paper chains. What are your lot doing?" I had no such intellectual answer, I'm afraid. Robbie was... before he succeeded Hirsch, he had no knowledge of or interest in international law at all, as far as I know. Right. They just needed to fill the chair.
Right.
And they thought Robbie was an adaptable sort of chap. He could get it up. Which he did. But I can't remember what... I mean... I think he was very much an English lawyer. He probably taught Roman law because nearly all law tutors in Cambridge did teach them Roman law. Right. They didn't know any, but it didn't stop them teaching. Yes. And he lived out in Grantchester.
His wife still lives there.
Does she?
Christine, yes.
She's nice.
Very.
She, when I was still going to faculty functions, she was still turning up occasionally. Very nice person.
She still comes.
Does she?
Yes.
Yes.
And she has agreed to be interviewed as well.
Oh, good.
Which will be lovely.
Good, yes.
I can sort of do Robbie by proxy, as it were.
Yes, absolutely, yes.
Someone else from that time, the Thornley. Does the name of Thornley mean anything?
Thornley, indeed.
Yes.
Never knew him well. He was the law tutor in Sydney. He had I don't know any of the details. He'd had a nasty war and was fairly badly disfigured. If he was a memorable person, I don't know why.
Well, the fact is, I've not heard anything about him.
No.
But obviously I've looked at the reporter for those years, and his name is on the staff list, so I thought I would just bring it up in case, you never know.
when I was doing my year in America as Commonwealth Fund Fellow, and the faculty offered me a job. And I had to wait because Thornley and somebody else had to be accommodated first because they'd been on the list first. If there was anything much ever to say about Thornley, I never knew it, as it were.
Mickey Dias?
Oh, yes, yeah. I haven't seen... Is he still around?
Well, sadly, I received the news the day before yesterday that he died this week. And I got in touch with his daughter, Julia, who was at Cambridge as well. And
she was indeed, yes.
She's a barrister now in London.
Yeah.
And she said that her father had been rather poorly. He'd had to leave his home about 2 or so years ago in Babraham Road, and he'd moved to some sort of a home, and that he really hadn't been well at all. Yeah. So that it wasn't a surprise, put it that way.
I'm sorry about that.
Yes.
He was a nice person, Mickey.
Everyone seems to have liked him very much. One of the reasons I'm in touch with Julia is that I'm going to visit her in London, and she's going to lend me some photographs of him when he was younger. And also she's going to give to the library his lecture notes that he took when he was attending Buckland's lectures, which I thought would be very useful to archive. And basically I'm going to go through his, she's got so much stuff that she just can't really. So, I wasn't actually going to mention it to you because it's sad, somewhat sad, but there it is, unfortunately.
Those academic scandals are, I think, fairly rare. Mickey Dias lectured in jurisprudence for years and years, and a man called Hughes published his notes of Dias's lectures as a textbook by Hughes, and there was a tremendous uproar in which I think Jack Hampson was called in to adjudicate. And they eventually decided that the book should be known as Dias and Hughes. And I've probably got a copy somewhere.
Very interesting.
My chief recollection is that when I looked at it, I recognised most of it. I'd never heard Mickey Dias lecture, but I had heard Glanville lecture, and so had Mickey. It really ought to have been Williams and Dias and Hughes. But Glanville would never have published the lectures under his own name anyway.
Right, that is very interesting. I actually, Mickey does narrate this saga for the archive, and his feelings about it. He was quite disconcerted by the whole thing.
It was an unpleasant little episode.
Very. Yes.
Most of us wouldn't think our colleagues' lectures were worth copying.
Derek Bowett is somebody who would have been around. Derek Bowett, I mean, he would have been he would have been the Ewell professor when you were in the chair at Cambridge.
I knew him by sight. I doubt if I ever exchanged words with him. I had the impression of a go-getter who went and got.
Yes, absolutely. My impression is of someone in a hurry.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Quite commendable.
Yes. Yes. So the determination was always there, as it were.
Yes. Perhaps some of the let me see. Colin Turpin is somebody who would have been in place.
Sorry?
Colin Turpin, constitutional law, South African.
Yes.
Yes.
Indeed. Claire?
That's right, yes.
Yes. I did exchange words with him, but not much more, because we didn't have much in common.
No.
A nice person.
Very, yes, very nice. Quite a few South Africans specialise in constitutional law.
Understandably, as it were.
Well, that's right, yes.
Whereas in England, you don't need to know anything because there isn't anything to know, as it were. It's all a question of what you can get away with.
Well, I mean, the current constitutional expert is a South African, Christopher Forsyth. He was mentored by Wade, and John Allison's another South African. So they're quite.
Don't think I know him. The earlier name you mentioned, I've immediately forgotten. Anyway, I met him, but no more, so there's nothing to say.
Professor Milsom, you retired in 1990, and did you find that you still continued to have much contact with the faculty?
I was never a very gregarious person, so I never had much contact with them, if the truth be told. And I don't think my retirement made much difference.
Did you? How did you find the new accommodation in the Sidgwick site? Was that sort of convenient for you? The times that you did go in?
Not really.
Because the thing is, I mean, you certainly considered, continued your historical research quite extensively after your retirement. So presumably you never needed to go into the library. You had your materials.
I had most of it here, and the rest of it I'd probably go to the UL.
Right. So it seems to me you found that your retirement gave you an opportunity to look back and reflect, so that you published a book which I hope we can look at in our next meeting in 2003. That was well after your retirement, your Natural History of the Common Law, So you've had a very busy retirement, Professor Milsom.
Yes, that started as lecturers somewhere. Can't even remember where.
That's right. I think that might have been the Carpentier lectures that you gave at Columbia.
That's right. That
Yes.
was, yeah, that's
Yes.
right.
Do you recall this occasion? The giving of those lectures in 1995?
Yes. They put me up in a hotel somewhere by Columbus Circus. I think the person who jobbed me into that, I'm sure, was Barbara Black, who was by that time no longer dean, but she had been dean at Columbia, and whom I had known for years because her husband was a great leading light at Yale, and she did some law school teaching at Yale, but when they went to Columbia, he I think got a job in Columbia, and then she did, and at that time he was still alive, and living in an apartment quite close to Columbia Law School. And I think my chief memory is of dinner parties being brought in from the local Chinese. A lot of fun.
Yes.
As I've proved to you, I'm so far out of things that I'm never quite sure who's alive and who's dead. I know he's dead. I think she's dead now too. I used to have to keep more or less straight about that when I used to send out Christmas cards. But I'm afraid I've found that Christmas was too much of a bore. Even getting to the Fitzwilliam Museum shop and buying cards. So I gave it up years ago.
Very sensible.
I still get a lot of cards from people, which makes me feel ashamed, so then I have to write to them. So I don't really save myself any trouble.
Still, on your retirement in 2001, you gave an address at the unveiling of the F.W. Maitland Memorial at Westminster Abbey. Can you recount this grand event, Professor Milsom?
There were a lot of people, as you can imagine.
Yes.
The dean himself, whose name I forget, presided and I think conducted a little service, actually. And the plaque is let into the floor, so what I had to do was to tow away a sort of green baize cover. Bit in fatigue, actually. But I'm sure Maitland would be pleased to be there, as it were. So he's actually buried in the Canary Islands, where he died. And I had to do a bit of propaganda. There was a school of thought wanting to dig him up and bring him back. I was terribly against that. I thought he ought to be left where his daughter had put him, as it were. Was a funny do that. All kinds of people. I have no idea who they were, but they all seemed to know about Maitland and know who I was. It was all rather alarming. There was a sort of party upstairs in some outwork of the Abbey, and I wasn't as lame then as I am now. There was a very steep flight of stairs down. I couldn't make it now. I just wouldn't. I would refuse to go up because I would know I'd be afraid to come down.
Yes.
Everybody being jolly inappropriately.
Well, I hope that you will be agreed to speak a little bit more about Maitland and his work and your approach in the next interview, Professor Milsom. And so I thank you again for yet another fascinating account and can only reiterate my gratitude to you. Thank you so much.
You're a marvellous listener. I would have died of boredom by now if I were you.
No, you don't mean that, Professor Milsom. You don't know what you say.